You're watching a live stream when D4vd's mother appears on camera for the first time since his conviction, and what she says challenges everything the public has accepted as truth about the case. Margaret Chen had remained silent throughout her son's trial, sitting in the courtroom daily, but declining all media requests for interviews or statements. Her decision to finally speak came weeks after David's conviction and sentencing, delivered through an emotional video posted to social media that immediately went viral. Sitting in her living room surrounded by photos of David as a child, Margaret made bold claims that her son was innocent and that media coverage had destroyed his reputation and poisoned public opinion before he ever had a fair chance at justice. Margaret's central argument focused on what she described as a rush to judgment, fueled by sensationalized media coverage that portrayed David as guilty from the moment he became a suspect. She argued that news outlets had reported allegations as facts, presented the prosecution's theory as established truth, and ignored evidence that contradicted the narrative of his guilt. According to Margaret, this media environment had made it impossible for David to receive a fair trial because potential jurors had been exposed to months of coverage, assuming his guilt. The emotional intensity of Margaret's statement was undeniable as she spoke about watching her son be vilified in public discourse while she maintained absolute certainty about his innocence. She described David as a gentle, misunderstood person whose social awkwardness had been reinterpreted as sinister behavior once he became a suspect. The friends who had come forward describing warning signs were, in Margaret's view, rewriting history and assigning malicious intent to innocent actions because they now knew how the story ended. Margaret specifically addressed Celeste Morgan's testimony about the false alibi, claiming that her son had been manipulated by prosecutors into appearing guilty. She suggested that Celeste Morgan had been pressured to change her story, and that the immunity deal offered in exchange for her testimony created incentive for her to say what prosecutors wanted to hear. Margaret argued that the original alibi statement Celeste provided was truthful, and that her later recantation was coerced. The physical evidence that had been central to the prosecution's case was dismissed by Margaret as circumstantial and subject to innocent explanations. She argued that DNA evidence could result from casual contact, that cell phone records could be misinterpreted, and that surveillance footage was too grainy to definitively identify anyone. In Margaret's view, the prosecution had constructed a narrative and then interpreted ambiguous evidence to fit that narrative rather than following where evidence actually led. Most controversially, Margaret suggested that law enforcement had focused on David to the exclusion of other suspects because they were under pressure to solve a high-profile case quickly. She claimed that evidence pointing to alternative explanations had been ignored or suppressed because it didn't fit the story investigators wanted to tell. Margaret called for the case to be reopened and for genuine investigation into what she believed was a wrongful conviction of an innocent person. The response to Margaret's statement was immediate and polarized. Celeste Rivas's family issued a statement expressing pain and frustration that they were being forced to relive their daughter's kidnapping through Margaret's denial of established facts. They emphasized that David had been convicted based on overwhelming evidence presented in a fair trial, and that Margaret's claims were simply a mother's understandable but misguided inability to accept her son's guilt. Legal analysts examining Margaret's claims noted that while family members of convicted individuals often maintain belief in innocence, her specific allegations about media bias, prosecutorial misconduct, and evidence manipulation were serious charges that would require concrete proof to be taken seriously. Without evidence supporting her claims beyond a mother's certainty about her son's character, the allegations appeared to be motivated by denial rather than facts. Now people are wondering, when a mother refuses to accept overwhelming evidence of her child's guilt, is she in denial, or does her intimate knowledge of her son give her insights others lack? Margaret Chen's public statement was followed by a series of interviews where she elaborated on her claims and provided what she believed was evidence that media coverage had been unfair and that the investigation had been flawed. Her campaign to defend David's reputation and challenge his conviction revealed the profound cognitive dissonance of a parent unable to reconcile the son she knew with the crimes he was convicted of committing. In a lengthy interview with a sympathetic podcast host, Margaret described David's childhood and upbringing in detail, painting a picture of a sensitive, intelligent boy who struggled socially but never showed signs of violence or cruelty. She spoke about his love of animals, his academic achievements, and his close relationship with her throughout his life. The David she described bore little resemblance to the predator portrayed in trial testimony and media coverage. Margaret provided examples of what she argued was biased media coverage, highlighting headlines and articles that she believed assumed David's guilt before trial. She compiled instances where news reports described him as the kidnapper or perpetrator rather than suspect or alleged perpetrator, arguing this language presumed guilt. Her media analysis showed genuine instances where coverage had been imprecise in distinguishing between allegations and proven facts, though legal experts noted that post-conviction coverage appropriately reflected his guilty status. The interview revealed Margaret's alternative theory about what had happened to Celeste Rivas. She suggested without specific evidence that Celeste might have left voluntarily, or been taken by someone else entirely, and that David's connection to the case was purely circumstantial and coincidental. When pressed on how this theory explained the physical evidence linking David to Celeste, Margaret became vague, suggesting that evidence could have been planted, or that innocent explanations existed that hadn't been properly explored. Margaret's explanation for Celeste Morgan's testimony revealed deep suspicion about prosecutorial tactics. She claimed that prosecutors had threatened Celeste with charges unless she changed her story to implicate David, and that the immunity deal was essentially blackmail that forced false testimony. Margaret had no direct evidence of this coercion, but pointed to the fact that Celeste's story changed as proof that something suspicious had occurred. Her reasoning reflected a pattern of working backward from the conclusion she wanted to reach. The friends who had described David's concerning behavior were dismissed by Margaret as attention seekers jumping on a bandwagon, or people reinterpreting innocent memories through the lens of his conviction. She argued that hindsight bias caused people to assign sinister meaning to normal social awkwardness once they knew how the story ended. Margaret maintained that David's interest in true crime was a common hobby, that his social difficulties were the result of shyness rather than predatory instincts, and that his interactions with women had been mischaracterized. Margaret's defense of her son included attacking the character and credibility of prosecution witnesses, particularly Celeste Morgan. She suggested that Celeste had been an unreliable person with her own legal troubles who had been manipulated by prosecutors into providing false testimony. When fact-checkers examined these claims, they found Margaret had exaggerated and mischaracterized Celeste's background, attributing to her minor issues that were either resolved or irrelevant to her credibility as a witness. The psychological toll of David's conviction on Margaret was evident in her emotional state during interviews. She spoke about being unable to sleep, about constant anxiety and depression, and about feeling like she had failed to protect her son from a justice system she now viewed as corrupt and flawed. Her genuine suffering as a mother created sympathy even among those who believed David was guilty, reflecting the reality that families of convicted criminals are also victims in their own way. Margaret's campaign included attempts to raise money for David's appeal and to hire investigators who would supposedly uncover evidence of his innocence that the original defense team had missed. The fundraising was controversial as critics argued she was essentially asking people to fund efforts to free someone whose guilt had been established through a fair trial. Supporters of Margaret contributed modest amounts, though the fundraising fell far short of the goals she had set. When a mother's love for her child conflicts with overwhelming evidence of terrible crimes, what responsibility do we have to distinguish between legitimate questions about justice and denial driven by inability to accept painful truths? The response to Margaret Chen's public defense of her son varied dramatically across different segments of society, revealing deep divisions about how to balance empathy for a mother's pain with accountability for spreading misinformation about a criminal case. Media outlets, true crime content creators, and legal experts all grappled with how to address her claims while being sensitive to her position as a grieving parent. Celeste Rivas's family responded to Margaret's statements with a mixture of anger, pain, and frustration. Through their attorney, they issued a detailed rebuttal to Margaret's claims, emphasizing that David had received a fair trial with competent legal representation, that evidence of his guilt was overwhelming and not circumstantial, and that Margaret's denial was causing additional trauma to their family. The statement asked Margaret to accept reality and to encourage David to provide information about what happened to Celeste so they could find closure. Legal experts who reviewed Margaret's specific allegations about media bias and prosecutorial misconduct found them largely without merit. While they acknowledged that pre-trial publicity can potentially affect jury selection, David's trial had included extensive voir dire specifically to identify and exclude jurors who had formed opinions based on media coverage. The jury that convicted him had been carefully screened to ensure impartiality, undermining Margaret's claims that media coverage prevented a fair trial. The allegations about Celeste Morgan being coerced into changing her testimony were examined by journalists who reviewed court records and interviewed people familiar with her decision to come forward. The evidence showed that Celeste had approached prosecutors voluntarily after struggling with guilt about the false alibi, not that she had been threatened or pressured. The immunity agreement was standard practice for witnesses who had committed minor offenses in connection with major crimes and didn't constitute improper inducement for false testimony. True crime content creators faced difficult decisions about whether and how to cover Margaret's statements. Some chose to present her perspective alongside factual corrections, acknowledging her pain while emphasizing that the evidence supporting David's conviction was substantial and reliable. Others declined to cover her statements at all, arguing that amplifying her claims gave unwarranted credibility to conspiracy theories about a wrongful conviction that the evidence didn't support. Mental health professionals discussing the case emphasized the psychological phenomenon of cognitive dissonance and how parents of convicted criminals often cannot reconcile their knowledge of their child with evidence of terrible crimes. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a psychologist specializing in family trauma, explained that Margaret's denial was a protective mechanism preventing her from experiencing the full emotional devastation of accepting that her son committed horrible acts. Understanding this psychology created empathy for Margaret's position while not lending credibility to her factual claims. Support groups for families of convicted criminals reached out to Margaret, offering community with others navigating similar experiences of loving someone who had committed serious crimes. These groups provided space for family members to process complicated emotions without judgment while also helping them work toward acceptance of reality. Some group members who had initially denied their loved one's guilt shared their own journeys toward acceptance, and the relief that eventually came from stopping the fight against established facts. The media platforms Margaret had accused of creating false narratives largely ignored her statements rather than engaging in public debate with a grieving mother. News organizations' editorial boards made decisions that responding to her allegations might give them more attention than they deserved, and could be perceived as punching down at someone in tremendous pain. The silence wasn't an admission of wrongdoing, but rather a professional judgment about what warranted response. Social media became a battleground where supporters and critics of Margaret's statements argued about her credibility and the validity of her claims. Some users expressed sympathy for a mother's love and supported her right to defend her son, while others argued that her platform was being used to spread dangerous misinformation that caused additional harm to victims' families. The debates revealed broader tensions about how society should respond when family members of convicted criminals refuse to accept guilt. Online investigations by amateur sleuths attempted to verify or debunk Margaret's specific claims about media bias and evidence problems. These efforts produced mixed results, with some finding legitimate examples of imprecise language in early media coverage, but no evidence supporting claims of prosecutorial misconduct or planted evidence. The amateur investigations sometimes created additional confusion by elevating conspiracy theories alongside legitimate fact-checking. When a mother publicly defends her convicted son by attacking the credibility of victims, witnesses, and the justice system, how do we balance empathy for her psychological pain with responsibility to prevent spread of misinformation that harms others? Margaret Chen's continued public campaign to prove her son's innocence led her to make increasingly specific allegations that could be verified or debunked through examination of public records and trial transcripts. Her claims provided a test case for how families of convicted individuals use media to challenge verdicts and what responsibility platforms have in addressing such challenges. Margaret released documents she claimed showed prosecutorial misconduct, including emails between prosecutors and witnesses that she argued demonstrated coordination of testimony. Legal experts who reviewed the documents found they showed normal trial preparation, where prosecutors helped witnesses understand what to expect during testimony, not improper coaching or coordination of false statements. The distinction between legitimate preparation and improper influence was lost on Margaret, who interpreted any contact between prosecutors and witnesses as sinister. The fundraising campaign for David's appeal attracted attention from wrongful conviction advocacy organizations who reviewed the case to determine whether it warranted their support. After thorough examination of trial transcripts, evidence, and Margaret's specific claims, these organizations declined to take David's case. Their assessment concluded that the conviction was supported by substantial evidence and that Margaret's allegations reflected a mother's denial rather than legitimate questions about justice. Margaret's campaign included publishing contact information for jurors who had convicted David, encouraging her supporters to reach out and ask them to reconsider their verdict. This action crossed ethical and potentially legal lines, as juror harassment could constitute obstruction of justice. Law enforcement had to intervene, warning Margaret that publishing jurors' information could result in charges and advising her supporters that contacting jurors was inappropriate and potentially criminal. The relationship between Margaret and David's defense attorneys became strained as she publicly criticized their performance during trial. She suggested they hadn't presented certain evidence or pursued specific strategies that she believed would have resulted in acquittal. The attorneys, bound by professional ethics about client confidentiality, couldn't fully respond to these criticisms but issued a statement saying they had pursued all viable defenses and that the verdict reflected the strength of evidence against David rather than inadequate representation. Margaret's media appearances grew more emotional and less coherent as time passed, and her campaign failed to generate the support or attention she hoped for. Interview hosts noticed her repeating debunked claims even after they had been fact-checked, suggesting she was either unable or unwilling to accept corrections to her narrative. The deterioration of her arguments made it difficult to maintain sympathy for her position even while recognizing her psychological pain. Online supporters of Margaret's campaign began developing conspiracy theories that expanded beyond her original claims to suggest broader corruption within the justice system. These theories alleged that multiple people were involved in framing David for reasons ranging from career advancement to covering up someone else's crimes. The conspiracy theories bore no relationship to evidence but gained traction in certain online communities predisposed to distrust law enforcement and media institutions. Mental health professionals who observed Margaret's public campaign expressed concern about her psychological state and the potential harm her activities were causing to both herself and others. Her inability to accept her son's guilt appeared to be preventing her from processing grief and moving toward any kind of healing. The continued fight against established facts was exhausting her emotionally while alienating potential support systems that might have helped her cope. Family members of other convicted criminals who had gone through similar processes of denial and eventual acceptance reached out to Margaret privately, sharing their own experiences and offering perspective. Some reported that Margaret was receptive to these conversations in private moments, but unable to apply their lessons to her own situation. The disconnect between private doubts and public certainty suggested internal conflict she wasn't ready to fully confront. The case study of Margaret's public campaign became relevant to discussions about platform responsibility for content that isn't technically false, but is misleading through selective presentation of facts and context. Social media companies struggled with whether her posts violated policies, as she was making claims about her son's case that she genuinely believed rather than spreading deliberate disinformation. The gray area between protected speech and harmful misinformation was difficult to navigate. When someone uses media platforms to wage a public campaign challenging a criminal conviction, presenting their perspective while omitting context and mischaracterizing facts, what responsibility do platforms have to provide balance or corrections without silencing a grieving parent's voice? As Margaret Chen's campaign continued over months, patterns emerged that showed how family denial of guilt evolves and how communities respond to such denial. Her trajectory became a case study in the psychology of families dealing with loved ones convicted of serious crimes and the complicated relationship between belief, evidence, and acceptance. Margaret began connecting with other parents of convicted criminals through online forums and support groups, finding community with people who shared her experience of believing their loved ones were wrongly convicted. These connections provided emotional support, but also reinforced her denial by surrounding her with others who validated her rejection of evidence. The echo chamber effect made it increasingly difficult for alternative perspectives to reach her. The content Margaret shared evolved from specific allegations about her son's case to broader criticisms of the criminal justice system, media sensationalism, and what she characterized as a presumption of guilt in high-profile cases. Her focus shifted from David's individual situation to systemic issues, perhaps because the systemic criticisms were easier to sustain than specific claims about his case that were repeatedly debunked. The expansion of her message found a somewhat larger audience among people critical of criminal justice institutions. Research psychologists studying family responses to conviction identified Margaret's case as demonstrating several common patterns: the initial shock and denial, the search for alternative explanations, the attribution of malice to witnesses and prosecutors, the expansion into broader systemic criticisms, and the eventual exhaustion or acceptance all followed trajectories seen in other families. Understanding these patterns helped professionals provide better support to families navigating similar experiences. Margaret's relationship with David during his incarceration was complicated by his own response to conviction. Prison correspondence that Margaret shared publicly showed David vacillating between maintaining innocence and hinting at remorse or acknowledgement of guilt. These inconsistencies created confusion about what David actually believed about his own culpability, but Margaret interpreted any hint of innocence claims as vindication, while dismissing statements that suggested guilt as coerced or taken out of context. The financial cost of Margaret's campaign became significant as she exhausted savings on private investigators, legal consultations, and publicity efforts that produced no meaningful results. Family members and friends who had initially supported her emotionally became concerned about her financial stability and the obsessive nature of her quest to prove David's innocence. Some staged interventions encouraging her to accept reality and focus on healing, but these efforts were generally unsuccessful. Media interest in Margaret's campaign waned over time as her claims became repetitive and were repeatedly shown to lack merit. Initial sympathetic coverage gave way to brief mentions and eventually virtual silence as outlets concluded that her perspective didn't add meaningful information to understanding the case. The loss of media attention was frustrating for Margaret, who interpreted it as evidence of conspiracy to suppress truth rather than as editorial judgment that her claims lacked newsworthiness. The impact on Margaret's other relationships was severe as her single-minded focus on defending David consumed her life to the exclusion of other connections and responsibilities. Friends reported that conversations with Margaret became one-dimensional, always returning to David's case and her grievances about his conviction. The inability to engage with other topics or aspects of life strained relationships to the breaking point, leaving Margaret increasingly isolated. Therapeutic interventions attempted by concerned family members had limited success because Margaret viewed therapists as part of a system she distrusted. Suggestions that accepting David's guilt might be necessary for her own healing were interpreted as attempts to make her betray her son. The distrust extended to anyone who didn't validate her belief in David's innocence, creating barriers to getting help processing her complicated grief. Some family members eventually had to set boundaries with Margaret to protect their own mental health and family stability. These boundaries often included limiting discussions about David's case or declining to participate in Margaret's campaign activities. The necessary self-protection created family rifts that added another layer of loss to the tragedy, as Margaret felt abandoned by people she believed should support her unconditionally. The long-term trajectory for families in Margaret's position varied according to research on the topic. Some eventually reached acceptance and began rebuilding their lives around the new reality. Others remained in denial indefinitely, their lives consumed by campaigns that had no prospect of success. A few found middle ground where they maintained relationship with their convicted family member while acknowledging guilt and working to make amends to victims. Margaret's path remained uncertain as she continued her campaign despite mounting evidence it was causing more harm than good. When a parent's love and inability to accept their child's guilt leads them into years-long campaigns that exhaust resources, damage relationships, and cause pain to victims' families, at what point does support for their grief become enabling of harmful behavior? The comparison between Margaret Chen's public defense of her son and the positions of other families involved in the case revealed the different ways people process tragedy and guilt. While Margaret remained locked in denial, other families demonstrated various approaches to coping with the reality that someone they loved had been involved in terrible events. Celeste Morgan's family provided a contrasting example of how to support a loved one who had been involved in a criminal case while acknowledging difficult truths. They publicly supported Celeste's decision to come forward about being manipulated into providing the false alibi, recognizing that her honesty required courage and came at personal cost. Rather than denying that Celeste had initially lied, they acknowledged her mistake while emphasizing that she had been deceived and had ultimately done the right thing by telling the truth. The families of David's friends who had observed concerning behavior navigated their own complicated positions. Some defended their relatives against criticism for not reporting sooner, while others acknowledged that earlier intervention might have been possible. These families modeled acceptance of complexity. Their loved ones hadn't been complicit in David's crimes but had missed opportunities to interrupt his trajectory toward violence. The nuanced position contrasted with Margaret's absolutist defense. Mental health professionals working with families touched by criminal cases emphasized that Margaret's reaction, while extreme, represented one end of a spectrum of normal responses to devastating news about a loved one. The shock of learning someone close to you committed terrible crimes activated powerful psychological defense mechanisms. Denial served the function of protecting the psyche from information too painful to immediately process. The problem arose when denial became permanent rather than a temporary stage in grief processing. Support groups for families of offenders provided space for people to work through their complicated emotions without judgment. Group members shared experiences of initial disbelief, the painful process of accepting evidence, the guilt about potentially having missed warning signs, and the challenge of maintaining relationship with someone who had caused terrible harm. The groups offered what Margaret needed but wasn't ready to accept: community with others who understood her pain without enabling her denial. Victim advocates working with Celeste Rivas's family provided perspective on how Margaret's campaign affected them. Every public statement Margaret made denying David's guilt required the family to relive their trauma and defend the validity of his conviction. The ongoing denial prevented any possibility of closure or healing, keeping wounds fresh years after the trial ended. Advocates emphasized that while Margaret deserved empathy for her pain, her actions caused real harm to people who were already suffering immensely. The contrast between Margaret's response and how some other parents of convicted criminals approached their situations was stark. Parents who acknowledged their children's guilt while maintaining love for them demonstrated that these two positions weren't mutually exclusive. They visited their convicted children, provided emotional support, and maintained family bonds while also accepting responsibility to validate victims' suffering and not make excuses for inexcusable actions. Research into family responses to conviction showed that acceptance of guilt, while initially more painful than denial, ultimately led to better long-term mental health outcomes for family members. Those who worked through denial to acceptance were better able to maintain relationships, find meaning after tragedy, and rebuild their own lives. Those who remained in permanent denial often experienced ongoing depression, anxiety, and isolation that compounded the original trauma. The question of what Margaret owed to victims' families versus what she owed to her son created ethical complexity that didn't have simple answers. A mother's loyalty to her child was understandable and even admirable in many contexts, but when that loyalty meant causing additional pain to innocent victims, the ethical balance shifted. Margaret's inability or unwillingness to recognize this balance reflected either genuine psychological limitation or a conscious choice to prioritize her son's reputation over others' pain. Some observers argued that Margaret's public campaign should be understood as a form of grief that deserved compassion even when her claims were false. They emphasized that criticizing her harshly or demanding she accept her son's guilt was expecting her to perform an acceptance she might not be psychologically capable of achieving. This perspective advocated for quiet disengagement rather than public confrontation, allowing Margaret to maintain her beliefs without amplifying them. Others argued that Margaret's use of public platforms to spread misinformation about the case gave up any claim to gentle treatment, and that her false claims needed to be actively countered to prevent harm. They pointed to the damage caused to victims' families and the potential for her narrative to inspire doubt about legitimate convictions. This perspective held that public false claims warranted public correction regardless of the speaker's psychological state. When denial of a loved one's guilt manifests as public campaign causing harm to victims while the denier appears psychologically incapable of accepting reality, what is society's responsibility in terms of both compassion for the denier and protection of those harmed by their actions? Years after David Chen's conviction, Margaret's campaign had largely faded from public attention, though she continued her efforts on a smaller scale within online communities of families who believed their loved ones were wrongly convicted. Her trajectory illustrated both the durability of denial and the ultimate futility of campaigns built on rejection of established facts rather than legitimate questions about justice. The appeal process that Margaret had fundraised for and put her hopes on was denied at multiple levels, with appellate courts finding no errors in the trial that warranted overturning the conviction. Each denial was devastating for Margaret, requiring her to either accept that the legal system had thoroughly reviewed and validated the verdict, or expand her conspiracy theories to include appellate judges. She chose the latter, maintaining her belief system by incorporating each new disappointment into a narrative of systemic corruption. David's own statements from prison evolved over time in ways that created tension with his mother's campaign. In some communications he maintained innocence, but in others he expressed remorse in language that suggested acknowledgement of guilt. The inconsistency might have reflected his own internal struggle, manipulation of different audiences, or the complicated relationship between legal strategy and personal truth. Margaret interpreted the statements selectively, highlighting proclamations of innocence while dismissing anything suggesting guilt. The psychological cost of Margaret's years-long denial became increasingly apparent to those around her. Her physical and mental health deteriorated from the chronic stress of her campaign and the isolation resulting from damaged relationships. Family members who had set boundaries to protect themselves watched helplessly as Margaret exhausted herself fighting battles that could not be won. Their offers of support contingent on her accepting reality were rejected as attempts to make her abandon her son. Some family members eventually reached the difficult conclusion that supporting Margaret meant enabling behavior that was harming her. They implemented complete disengagement, cutting off contact until she was willing to engage with reality and seek appropriate help for her grief. The tough love approach was agonizing for everyone involved, but felt necessary to avoid participating in her self-destruction. Whether this approach would ultimately help Margaret or push her deeper into isolation remained uncertain. Celeste Rivas remained missing, with David maintaining his silence about her fate despite Margaret's pleas that he tell her what happened if he was indeed guilty. The not knowing tortured both families in different ways, the Rivas family desperate to find their daughter and achieve closure, Margaret tormented by the possibility that her son might have information he was withholding. David's silence kept both families suspended in agonizing uncertainty. The case study of Margaret's response to David's conviction became teaching material in psychology and social work programs, examining family trauma and pathological grief. Her trajectory illustrated how protective mechanisms could become destructive when maintained beyond their useful period. Students learned about the importance of meeting people where they are psychologically, while also recognizing when support becomes enablement of harmful patterns. The broader lessons from Margaret's campaign extended to discussions about how society should respond when family members publicly defend convicted individuals in ways that cause harm to others. The balance between compassion for their pain and responsibility to victims required nuanced thinking that acknowledged multiple legitimate perspectives. There were no perfect answers, only varying approaches that prioritized different values and considerations. Victim advocates who had worked with Celeste Rivas's family throughout the ordeal reflected on the additional burden created by Margaret's denial. The family had to maintain their defenses and re-justify the conviction years after it occurred rather than being allowed to process their grief and move forward. The ongoing public conflict kept them trapped in adversarial positions when they needed space for healing. Mental health professionals who had attempted to help Margaret, or who studied her case, reflected on the limitations of therapeutic intervention when someone wasn't psychologically ready to accept painful truths. The case reinforced understanding that healing couldn't be forced, and that each person's timeline for working through denial was individual. What looked like stubbornness might be psychological necessity for survival, even when observers could see that the protection was causing more harm than good. The final assessment of Margaret's campaign was that it achieved none of its stated goals, but did illustrate important truths about family trauma, the psychology of denial, and the complicated relationship between love, loyalty, and truth. Her story was tragic not because of injustice, but because of the inability to accept a devastating reality that no amount of campaigning could change. David remained in prison serving his sentence, Margaret continued her smaller-scale efforts to prove his innocence. Celeste Rivas's family continued their search for their daughter, and Celeste Morgan continued her healing from manipulation and her journey towards self-forgiveness. Each person trapped in their own version of aftermath from crimes that had rippled through multiple lives and left no one untouched. When a mother's love becomes denial that causes ongoing harm, when her pain is genuine but her actions are destructive, when she deserves compassion but her campaign deserves condemnation, how do we as a society hold space for all these truths simultaneously without collapsing into either cruel judgment or enabling harm?